Good evening all and welcome, and with the festivities approaching, I thought I would throw out there a topic which many of you enjoy: Skinwalkers and Cryptids. Remember, if you're new to the channel or haven't subscribed, be sure to do so, as there's new content every night. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I worked at the County Historic Preservation in Southern Appalachia, working on buildings and properties the county owned. One of the benefits included with my job was living on site at one of the historic properties. The historic house was an imposing brick mansion built in the 1810s, and I lived in a small caretaker's house about 20 feet away. This was in the backwoods, so to deter trespassers and vandalism, the county had built an 8-foot-tall fence around the entire 5-acre parcel and put barbed wire atop of the fence. I mention all of this just to show that it was basically impossible for anyone or anything to jump over or climb over the fencing and onto the property. One night after working late at another property, I pulled up to my entrance gate, let myself in, locked it behind me, and then drove the 100 yards down to the gravel road to my house. There were no lights on the property, so I could only see by my headlights. As I turned my car around the corner of one of the outbuildings and parked it, my lights shone on a thing that I still have a hard time describing effectively. It was the size of a deer, but with long, spindly legs and long, shaggy hair. Almost like a taller maned wolf, if you've seen pictures of those. That alone shook me. There was no way that something of that size should have been able to get through or over my fencing. What follows is absolutely true. I got out my car to get a better look at what the hell the thing was, and as I opened the door to go out, the thing took off running, not on 4 legs, but on 2. I literally watched this thing raise its back up, stand at full height on its back legs and sprint away. I absolutely freaked out at that point, grabbed my mag light and my shotgun out from inside and tried to find the thing again. But there were no traces, no tracks, no anything. I have no idea how it got in or out of my property. I didn't sleep well that night. I just sat on my couch with my shotgun watching the front door, hoping that whatever I saw didn't come back and burst in. I cannot explain what the hell I saw that night, but it still raises the hair on my neck every time I think about it. I'm a 17-year-old female who only recently found out about these communities. I grew up watching ghost adventures and fact or fiction, paranormal files, all total BS, but it just goes to show that I've always been aware and interested in this stuff. But after hearing others' experiences, I figured I should share some of my own, in hopes of getting any advice or answers as to what could be messing with me. I live in Florida and have always been aware of many Native American cultures, even though I'm not of heritage myself. Not sure if this is pertinent, but I timelined it and tried to write down everything I remembered about these experiences. It started from when I was very young, and the first instance of this happened when I was living with my grandmother. Her and I were very close. This will play a part later. You see, I was wide awake in bed, unable to sleep with her to my right. There was no doubt in my mind that she was deeply asleep, only a few inches from me. Every television in the house was off, and the only other person in the house was my grandfather, who was asleep in his room. Then very clearly and loudly I hear my grandma call me from the kitchen, almost how you'd be called for dinner. I know it's common to hear your name being called mistakenly, but I did more research on this as a teen, and apparently when you hear your name being called this loud, you're supposed to reject it, but I didn't. Not knowing this, I hustled closer to my grandmother and kept my eyes locked on the open door. The second instance was when I was around 13, when my father took me on a family trip to Las Vegas. We visited some part of the Grand Canyon, and while my family were waiting in line for a skywalk bridge we had paid a tour for, I wandered around the edge a good distance away from my family and decided to yell my name into the canyon to hear my echo. When it came back to me, it sounded distorted and almost like grandmother had yelled my name back. It might have not been my grandmother exactly, but it sounded very similar. Nevertheless, just the fact that it was distorted was enough to scare me a little. I don't put too much weight into this experience because it might have just been my voice being thrown weird. The next one happened when I was 13 or 14 as well. It was the most terrifying one I've ever had happened. When I start telling this to people, I actually start tearing up. This is the closest I've ever been to whatever this thing was, and proved the point that it was mimicking the people I care about. I was on a vacation with my family to Key West and had rented a home. I invited my best friend, who is called Ash, to stay with us. On the third day, we had decided to skip out on the boating trip and mooch off the house owner's Netflix all day. On the fifth episode of whatever we were watching, we decided to refill snacks and have a bathroom break. We pause the television and I make my way to the kitchen. I think Ash had followed me into the kitchen, and when I leaned on the island while I was preparing some chips with my back turned to her, I held a full conversation with whatever that thing was and even looked back at her on her phone. I fully had no doubt in my mind that I was talking and looking at Ash on her phone. I turned my back for a split second to pick up the bowls and suggest we head back to the couch, when I see Ash, or should I say, the real Ash, walk out the bathroom, which was a solid 30 feet away. My body immediately went cold, and the first thing I asked her was how she got into the bathroom without me hearing. She then gave me the weirdest look and told me that she'd been in there the whole time since we got up. This is where I start freaking out and insisting that I had just been there speaking with her and physically saw her. She joked about doppelgangers and how maybe she was going to die. I quickly suggested we get out of the house and walk around the neighborhood. She then informed me she'd gotten her period while she was in the bathroom at the same time that I was talking to whatever I was talking to. We walked around until my mum came, and she was back in the house. We're still best friends to this day and have been for 11 years, and I asked her about it today before I decided to jot this all down, and she said that she didn't hear me talking with anybody at all. Now at this point you guys must think I'm crazy, but for this next one I have a witness. I felt a little less crazy after it happened with people who freaked out as much as me. Again on this occasion, we were on vacation near the Great Smoky Mountains, just a little bit west of Sevierville, Tennessee. We had our previous reservations cancelled, so we took this little rundown cabin owned by a local woman. Now we got there late at night, and the moment we all stepped out the car, the first thing we heard was a man's voice saying, "Hey neighbors," coming from a cabin to the left of ours that was higher up on the mountains where we were. We couldn't see the cabin really, just a road that led further up, so we assumed he could see us, but we couldn't see him. Probably some guy on his balcony. My friend's stepdad yelled, "Hey," and we waved up towards the direction it came from. It wouldn't have been weird if it hadn't have happened every time we stepped out of the cabin or car. My family completely wrote it off as some type of hospitality. We were not used to it in Miami. Retelling it, my brother and my friends agreed it was strange. We did hear constant footsteps around the cabin at night, and some outside my window. It was a raised cabin, probably a story or two off the ground, but I didn't give it too much thought since wildlife is a thing in the woods. Just something I thought I should mention. The thing that really propelled me into researching what the hell was happening to me was when I was having a photo shoot in the woods behind the cabin, and both my brother and sister and I heard something calling my name deeper in the woods. Since I was with my younger siblings, I went into full big sister protection mode and almost threw them back down the little slope we had to climb to get into the woods. We were all crapping ourselves from how clear it was, and how we all pinpointed it was coming from deeper in the woods and nowhere near the cabin. This was all during the day, and we were all so thrown by this that we stayed in for the rest of our trip. We all agreed it was a woman's voice, and the first thing I asked my mum when we got outside was, "Did you call me?" She had been lounging in her room with my stepdad all day, trusting that I would take care of the younger ones just outside the cabin. She saw how freaked out the kids were, and we didn't really go out at night for the rest of our trip. I think I reacted this badly to this one mostly because I had kids to take care of, and I can tell they were terrified out there. Again, the voice sounded like someone was looking for me or calling me back somewhere. With no knowledge of what this could have been, I had finally decided to look into things when I turned 17. I had no previous knowledge of Wendigos or Skinwalkers or anything cryptic, only crappy ghost investigations and Zach Baggins making something out of a scratchy EVP. I'm desperate for answers at this point because I'm constantly thinking about it and driving myself into rabbit holes of information and myths and legends. If you've heard this, thank you so much. I really would appreciate any input. Much love to anyone who wishes to help. The year was 1995. I had just graduated high school, and an old friend who I hadn't spoken to in 7 years now and I were hanging out. And we mutually agreed to go to New Orleans. And we did. We had $140 between us, and back then that was more than enough. We made it to New Orleans, almost died from culture shock, and turned around and headed to Magnolia to get some sleep. We stayed at Magnolia Inn. It was a dump, but it was nice and cool in May or June. And in that state at that time of year, cool was the only adjective that mattered. We stayed up that night playing poker, drinking Gordon's vodka, and talking about who knows what. Probably girls, college, and college girls. At some point I said, "Ever been to Texas?" "Nope." So we packed our bags and started to roll. We had a road atlas, and Marshall, Texas was right across the border from Shreveport. We arrived in Shreveport, made a phone call to another friend who we were actually supposed to be staying with. Both of our mothers had called looking for us, and the only person that knew where we were was the buddy on the phone. It was no big deal. We knew that we would be home in a day or so. I'm being short of details here because I don't want to turn this into a novel about chasing armadillos and being chased off by the bogeyman. Before I left the rest area in Shreveport, when we made the call, we saw an armadillo. Let me tell you something about armadillos. Those little dastardly creatures will hiss, jump, and turn into Tasmanian devils if you corner them. They also carry leprosy. We were 18 and chased the armadillo around for an hour. Now let me tell you about Shreveport. I don't know how it is now, but in the summer of '95 it looked and smelled like a place where oil and metal went to die. It was dirty and a crap hole. We crossed a bridge and saw people fishing 100 yards from where a drainage pipe from a factory was spewing filth. The locals reminded me of locals in Adamsville, bald-headed women and cross-eyed men. A lot of bald-headed, cross-eyed kids as well. I'm sorry, but to me it was a Rob Zombie movie come to life. I felt like my life was going to be over because I had a head full of hair and could see straight. The best part of Shreveport was an armadillo that might possibly have leprosy, and Marshall, Texas was 40 miles away, so we rolled on. Marshall was a decent little town, home of the Fire Ant Festival. We stopped at a little barbecue joint and had a Coke, a smile, and some pulled pork. It was getting late, and the sun was setting. We looked at the map and decided to backtrack a bit and headed up a rural route, 43, through Karnak and past Caddo Lake. We would eventually run to Highway 59, head to Texarkana, and then head back home. When we left the big barbecue joint and headed towards 43, it was dusk. Highway 43 wasn't well lit at all. My friend was driving and we were doing about 45. Any faster would have been reckless even for a couple of 18-year-olds. This road was kind of like Christmasville Road. The non-locals just have to use your imagination. It was dark, winding, full of hills that ended in curves, and there were beady glowing eyes on both sides of the road. You could hear crickets and the bullfrogs over the sound of the wind brushing by that old Sentra. It was peaceful and creepy at the same time. The humidity was a real thing, tangible. The air was thick. It smelled like pastures, hay, and swamp. We drove for what seemed like hours, and it was after midnight that I saw a sign that informed me that Bivins was the next town of any size. I was hypnotized by the yellow lines on the road. We hadn't seen another car in at least an hour. Sleepy, I rolled the window down and lit a cigarette. There was music coming from the radio, the tape player. It was either Tupac or Bob Seger. I smoked my cigarette, absent-mindedly flicking ashes out the window. I took one last puff and flicked the camel shot off into the woods, and then I saw it. I never looked to my right. I didn't even kind of peek to the right. Maybe I did a little when I flicked the cigarette away, I don't know. But what I do know is that in my peripheral, there was something running alongside the car. It was just behind my window, behind where the edge of the door ends and before where the back window begins. I looked over at the speedometer, 40 miles an hour. I looked at my friend and he was looking straight ahead. I looked straight ahead. I could still see it. I could see one huge arm of matted hair of reddish-brown, sticky-looking and primal. I eased my right hand over and rolled up my window. My friend was still looking straight ahead, his jaw clenched, and he put both hands on the wheel. He sped up. No words were said. I looked straight ahead, and still out of my periphery I could see that arm moving. Muscles and tendons visibly rippling beneath matted hair. As the car gained a little speed, the thing running alongside us lost pace. Slightly. I then saw the hand at the end of the nightmarish arm. The hand was clenched into a fist the size of a cantaloupe, a big cantaloupe, and covered in the same hair but slightly darker around the fingers, like it was stained with something. Suddenly the hand unclenched, and then I saw the claws. Black as this damned after midnight Texas night. Those claws were at least 2 inches long, sharp like an animal's. This wasn't a hand so much as it was a killing paw, and the claws of some beast whose only purpose was to kill and eat. I looked back at my friend. I looked at the speedometer, 50 miles an hour. I looked straight ahead and it was still there. I lit another cigarette, didn't roll the window down and simply said, "Crap." The music had stopped. I finally broke the silence and said, "Hey, do you..." And before I could finish, my buddy said, "I see it. I've been seeing it. I can't even see you, but I can see whatever the hell that thing is." "How much do you see?" "More than I want to." "Speed up, John. Just speed up. It can't keep up forever." I looked down at the speedometer. 55 miles an hour. Whatever was chasing us silently was starting to lag behind. I finally looked over to my right just a bit. Imagine the scary part of the movie where you put your hand up in front of your face but still peek through. In 37 years I have 2 regrets. One is picking up that first cigarette, and the other is me looking to my right that night. The beast was huge. Its chest was above the top of the car, and all I could see was that matted reddish-brown hair. Then it bent forward as it ran. I saw the face of this thing. All reality stopped. We were no longer driving down some country road in Texas. We were now trying to escape from the depths of a monster that inhabited hell. This thing's face is beyond my powers to describe. It was evil, the eyes were black, and the pupils were red. It flashed its teeth at me in a snarl, yellow and huge. Saliva dripped from its mouth. It opened its eyes wide, and it looked hungry and pissed off. Then it opened its mouth. The skin pulled back until all you could see were black gums and yellow teeth. Immediately I could feel the car accelerate. I just went. I prayed and cussed, lit a cigarette, and then like sunshine breaking through the clouds, the road straightened out. "Don't you slow down." We drove through Bivins and drove through Texarkana, and then we drove home. We never said a word. It was years later, 11 to be exact, before we even talked about it again, and we didn't even talk about it much. He said he'd never told anyone, and neither had I. I told the story a few years back for the first time while I was parked out on a gravel road, doing the things you do when you're parked out on gravel roads with a good-looking woman. I told it a year or so ago to a couple of kids who wanted to hear a scary story while they sat around a campfire. They didn't sleep for a day or two, but they asked me a dozen more times to tell them the story. And I never told anyone until now that I saw its face. I've been scared for my life exactly 2 times. Once was on that road, and the other was looking at a grizzly bear in front of me with a terminal velocity including drop to the other side of me. Call it what you will. Call it crap if you want to, but look me in the eyes and let me tell you this story, and you'll know. Never doubt there are things in this world that defy explanation and logic. The bogeyman is real. Some 16 or 17 years after this happened, I ran across a story and a movie called The Legend of Bogey Creek, Fauke, Arkansas, where the aforementioned story and movie takes place. It isn't that far from Bivins, Texas as the crow flies. Invite me over, buy me a beer, sit on the porch with me, and I'll tell you this story over a pack of Marlboros and a few of those beers. My dad once told me a story about a creature he once saw. Something I believe was a skinwalker. This was in the very early 80s, in late fall, before I was born. My sister had come down from Toronto to visit with my parents. She left sometime at a little after 9 p.m, but roughly 7-ish miles away from home, her car broke down. At least she broke down in front of a family friend's house, and they said she could use their phone. She called Dad and he came down and picked her up. The friend said that she could just leave her car in the driveway until the next day. She decided to stay at our parents' for the night and head out in the morning. As they're coming back, it's now a little after 10 p.m. While driving through a particularly wooded spot, they hear a loud, inhuman scream. It was so loud it drowned out the radio, the engine, and even their voices for the split second that it happened. Dad slammed on the brakes and they started freaking out, when suddenly something appeared at the edge of the car's lights on the side of the road. It was a coyote, at least 7 feet tall, and was walking on its hind legs, and had a black and white striped tail. It walked across the road in front of their car, then once again it disappeared across the road, when they heard the scream again, only far louder than the first time. Safe to say, they got the hell out of there quickly. My family owns the farm in the heart of an Indian reservation. One winter, I was home from Christmas taking care of the farm while my parents were away Christmas shopping. As I was home by myself way late into the night, and I heard all of our cows freaking out. I knew it had to be wild dogs that are rampant in the area, so I throw on some boots, grab a shotgun and load it up, and head out to the field. This was a perfect scenario for a horror movie. It was cloudy, but there was a full moon, and it was breaking through the clouds, making it just right to light up all the snow. I ran out into the middle of the field, and just in time to see 2 giant dogs. They were standing up facing each other and fighting. I think perfect 2 for 1. So I pump a shell into the chamber of the MR12, and then it happened. The 2 dogs heard the rack, they both stopped, looked over at me, and ran away on their hind legs. Immediately I froze, and every ghost story about skinwalkers and all the other Native American legends I grew up with flew through my mind. Keep in mind I'm a white guy, and up until then these were just boogeyman stories that all the native kids liked to tell us to scare us. That night, they became real to me. I was about 15 or 16, walking home from a friend's place at about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, with the friend I was living with at the time. My mate was pushing a BMX and we were just talking and laughing as we walked home. All of a sudden we saw what looked like 2 very large greyhounds jump over a set of mailboxes at some flats and landed in the middle of the road. The mailboxes appeared to be 1.5 meters tall and about 5 to 6 meters from the road. At that moment I thought it was a little strange, but kept watching them. What I witnessed was something I will never forget in all my life. The two greyhounds, as they ran down the road, appeared to both stand up on their hind legs and morph into a much bigger, much beefier being, which I can only describe as looking like a yowie, which I guess is the equivalent to a Sasquatch to our friends from America and other countries. These yowies both ran around the corner about 200 meters in the direction we came, and we both sat there dumbfounded. A few seconds later we heard what sounded like a small female child scream in terror. Keep in mind it was around 3 a.m. in the morning and there were no children out. We both looked at each other in horror without saying a word, and I jumped on the handlebars of the bike and he pedaled away, non-stop, all the way home about 2 kilometers away. When we got home we locked the doors as we had no idea what we just saw. I asked him to describe what he had seen to me, and I was in disbelief as he explained the exact same thing I witnessed. That is probably the scariest thing I've ever seen in my life. I've only told a few people about it, and I don't think a single person has believed me. They all say drugs, alcohol, blah blah blah, but how can two people have seen the exact same thing at the exact same time and it not be true? My grandpa lived in Myton, Utah, and he told stories about skinwalkers and how they could take the form of any animal or anyone you knew. I asked him one day, "Did you ever meet one?" "Yes," he replied solemnly. "A long time ago, before you were ever born, before your mother was born. It was when I was young and foolish. I went to the valley of the skinwalkers. It's a valley where life never enters, not even the crows. The very guardians of death will not go there. They too fear the evil that lives there." He continued with his story. "I went out there to show people that nothing evil existed in the valley, nothing but their fears. But I was wrong." He went on that he had gone to the Skinwalker Valley in his old red Ford truck to prove to everyone that they were what he thought they were, just stories used to scare people. But when he reached the valley, the grass was black, as if it had been burnt and survived the fire. The trees looked dead, but were still alive, and he told me he saw a house not far from where he stood. It was old and the roof was caved in, the door was gone, and he walked towards it. There were strange markings on the side of the house, animal skeletons were thrown about the property, and it was as if it were a sacred burial ground. Then he heard his grandmother. She had died long ago, but he heard her voice. The spirits were calling for him, for his life, for his skin, and for his blood. They were the lost souls that could change forms from man to beast. They chased him, scared him, and told him that they would never forget him. Whenever I visited my grandpa, he would show me something that was brand new, but was broken the next day. These spirits would kill his animals, so he finally stopped keeping his dogs outside. It got to the point where I snapped at him, telling him the stories were lies. I told him, "Prove it." He turned around and pulled up his shirt. His back was full of claw marks, torn, wide open, scars from eons ago. I was scared and started to cry. She told my grandpa to put his shirt down, but he just stared out at the field across the road. She finally gave up and carried me inside, but as I looked over my mother's shoulder, I saw a large black dog yonder with white eyes watching Grandpa, as if it were watching him, waiting for it to attack, but it never did. My grandpa died 2 months later. The doctor said his heart gave out, but I knew what really ended him. That was 42 years ago. No one has believed me, but it's true, so I will tell you Never look into a Skinwalker's eyes. It won't forget you. If you do, sooner or later it will have you. You can fight and refuse, but if that's the case, then I hope you're not afraid to die. My mum and I were driving home after having dinner at our new property with friends and family. My aunt is in the front with us and we're following her home. She's doing the same since we live pretty close together, and we reach a bend and my aunt slows down and her lights shine on a dog. I immediately recognize it as a dog and my mum goes, "Ah, look, it's cute." But it's taller than the average dog and very wide and not in an overfed way. Its hair is very long and matted, some pieces reaching the floor, and it's jet black. Its face is huge, smiling with yellow eyes and the mouth ajar. I tell her before she finishes her sentence that it's not a dog, about 3 times in a row. She goes, "Yes, then realizes it's not. Before she could tell me it was a dog, it stared at her right in the eyes, windows tinted up and all. She felt the same chill as I did when I originally saw it. After glancing at it at first, I no longer looked at it directly because I knew they hear what you think. Its gait was as if it were a human on all fours. It was extremely disproportionate and large. I've never seen fur that long in a dog. It looked as if the pelt was thrown on and hanging loosely. We get home and my aunt says she didn't even see it. We assumed she slowed down to look at it since my mum and aunt are very big animal lovers and are affectionate. We get inside and my aunt drives home. We discuss it and she agrees it was not a dog. I've experienced the same thing a few times before, but I believe once you know, you can always recognize them. My name is Trace, and last summer my family and I took a trip to England and the surrounding UK countryside. I mean last summer as in 2019, obviously since COVID scrapped everyone's travel plans this year. Just to clarify and avoid confusion with my timeline, I am from the Western United States and enjoy traveling. My family usually takes holidays once a year, together around the US, but last year, we were going out the country. I used to go every year when I lived with my parents, but I'm 25 now and married and living on my own. However, we still get invited to go on family trips with them, and this is one that had been in the works for years. My parents very generously invited us along and offered to pay for our fares to the UK. We graciously accepted and ecstatically anticipated the adventure. It had been a dream of my father's to return to England for a long time. My father had lived in England for a few years while working for the church. Growing up, he would tell us stories of some of the experiences he had with people he met, as well as the places he had visited. The cultural differences, how he missed the food, how the weather was, and how the fog would roll in from the ocean and enshroud the city. He also had some otherworldly stories that he did not like to mention or delve much into, and most of the time if he were asked, he would claim to not know what you were talking about. I still do not know all of the details from a lot of these stories, and after being turned away so much from them, I've learned to stop asking. However, my interest in them was kindled in this way. I was extremely excited to visit the UK, since I had grown up hearing so much about it, and on top of that, I love exploring new foreign places and cultures. We started our trip in London, and were to make a road trip up to Inverness and then loop back, making stops along the way. Along the way, we saw that there is a lot of history to behold. There were many places that seemed as if they had been frozen in time from the 1800s. It was an interesting and beautiful trip, as we took a train away from the big city of London to York, and then rented a car to take us back to Edinburgh and Inverness. Cobblestone roads leading up to castles set upon green hills and cliffsides directed my thoughts to the time periods where the feats of men were still in operation for their initially intended use. These country settings forced the infamous mariner's log regarding the lake to mind. He came to me in my sleep. From the foot of my bed I felt a sensation, He took everything. We must return to England. We shall not return here again, at the request of the rake. Stories of the rake surfaced and filled through my brain as we drove down the narrow roads of Scotland back to London. We had been in the UK for a little over a week, and our next stop along the way was a relatively small town in the Lake District. This town had a lot of tangling cobblestone streets coursing through the tightly packed houses, and stories which were all gathered around one thing lining a strip of lake. Outside the town was nothing but countryside for miles. It was very gorgeous and pristine, but also very quiet. I grew up around the wilderness and quiet meadows and mountainsides, although here I felt almost uneasy. The day we were driving in, I started to get sick with a terrible sore throat and cough, and to make things worse, my ears had been plugged up for the entire 5.5-hour car ride. We pulled up to the house that would be ours for the next 3 days in the late afternoon, as the sun was beginning its descent and started to paint the sky yellow. We unloaded our bags and took them inside. There was a kitchen and living room on the first floor, and a steep staircase leading to a master bedroom on the left and a second bedroom to the right. My wife and I's room was one on the right. We lugged our bags up and then put them on the bed, and then examined our room and bathroom that were connected to the back of the room. There was a window that looked up and down the cobblestone streets and the other tight houses packed around the U-shaped piece of street that we were located on. Looking out the window from the bed, we could only see the steep stacked roof shingles and the protruding metal chimney pipes. One thing that I found odd was as I first walked into the room, what looked to be an access window to the attic was there. I am used to attic panels being in the ceilings, not being quite so big, but these panels were in the wall and maybe a foot above where the headrest of our bed was. It was a 3 foot by 3 foot cutout in the wall with 2 white wooden floorboards matching in size to fit, as if to act to some sort of door. The left board fit perfectly into the frame, but the board on the right sat a little further back so that it could be slid behind the left board to allow passage. The right board even had a small hand cut out on the right side of it, proving its purpose was a type of sliding door. I did not think much of it, simply that it was an old place and an attic to me. We then left the house with everyone to go grab dinner for a local restaurant in town. Upon returning from dinner, we retired to our rooms, all of us exhausted from travel. I stayed up for a while talking with my wife, and knowing that it was all going to be hard for me to sleep with how sore my throat was. I hadn't had a sore throat that bad since I had strep throat a few years back. As we got ready for bed and laid down, I started to re-examine the room. While looking around at the room, my gaze fixed on the boards to the attic above our bed, and noticed that the right board in the attic doorway hadn't been in its framed track for sliding. It was at a slight angle, with the top of it leaning up against the top of the frame from the inside, and the bottom set back slightly into the attic, leaving about a 1/4 inch gap, if that, along the sides of the bottom position of the board, which allowed a peek at the pitch dark space within the attic. This detail didn't seem incredibly weird to me at the time. What made me uncomfortable was just the fact that we would be sleeping with our heads so close to a door leading into an unknown space that we had not been in or seen, since it was just an attic after all. I hadn't opened the attic because I figured it was none of my business to snoop through someone else's attic. It came time to turn out the light and go to sleep. The atmosphere of the town mixed with my head cold, and the fact that we were sleeping under a creepy attic door left me feeling on edge. I figured that the faster I slept, the faster I wouldn't be conscious to overthink and keep myself up all night with my thoughts. It took some time and some cold medicine, which ended up knocking me out rather quickly. The next morning, as we were getting up and ready for the day, I noticed that my wife Kathy looked very tired. I asked her if she felt sick, and she replied that she hardly slept that much. Was I tossing and turning too much? She said it wasn't that, so I asked why. She started to explain that she was woken up in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. by a cold burst of air rushing past her that made all the hairs on her body stand on end. As she lay there trying to shake the eerie feeling of being watched, in an attempt to slip back into sleep, she heard a lady's voice faintly begin to cry from behind the boards of the attic. Since my parents were in the room right across the stairway from us, Kathy first thought that it was my mum crying softly in the other room. But it was not long until the crying got louder and closer. It sounded like it was coming from directly behind the boards to the attic. Then it would occasionally appear to be coming from higher up in the wall. It was breathy, heavy sobs, followed by a prolonged wail of lamentation. The crying would stop for a few seconds, only to have long and deliberate scratching up and down the wall from within the attic take its place. The woman's voice would start to whine, whimper, and cry loudly again. For over 2 hours the crying and scratching were persistent and loud. Then she said it was as if whatever it was got bored, let out a low-toned moaning noise and slowly ran its nails along the wall, returning deeper into the attic where the crying had faintly started. The quiet of the night returned, but the sun was only about an hour from rising at that point, so she stayed up and cuddled next to me. I was astonished when I heard all this, as anyone should be. Kathy asked my mum just to be sure if she had been crying at all last night, and my mum, confused, said that she had not been. No one else had been awake to hear anything. I decided not to dwell on it, and try to avoid all mention of it happening, because we still had one more night in the place before we were all to leave the Lake District, and I did not want that to burden on her all day. After a full day of taking in different sights in the countryside, it was again time to come back into town, have dinner, and settle in for the night. We stayed up a little later, talking and laughing to keep our mind off what was happening, until we were pretty tired. After turning out the light, I felt myself dozing in and out of sleep after seeing that Kathy had fallen fast asleep next to me. I rolled over on my right side facing the window, as I felt myself about to succumb to slumber. I felt an overwhelming feeling of being helpless. I froze as I felt like I was being watched from behind. I glanced around the part of the room that was within my viewpoint without moving. I didn't see anything. Nothing outside the window either. It definitely felt like I was being watched from behind. My back was now turned to the loose, right side board to the attic, as well as the opposite side of the room where our door to the stairs was. My hairs all stood on end as I lay motionless, now noticing that the air was cold. I started to hear someone running around in the small gravel driveway down below the window where the car was parked. This small driveway was also gated. Footsteps in the gravel happened for a few minutes, then it got quiet for a little while. Not too long after, there were sounds like something had gotten on the roof. Light scratching started on one portion of the roof and led to another part above us. This was followed by gravel consequently rolling down the shingles back to the ground below. Then everything got exceptionally quiet, but the feeling of being stalked did not go away. I forced myself to focus my mind on something else. Before long, I was falling back to sleep in the unearthly silence. When I woke up, the sky was a faint, dim blue, as morning was about to break. I had only slept for a few hours. The place still felt eerie, but I no longer felt like I was being watched. I remained in bed, staring out the window, and contemplating the events that had taken place here over the past 2 nights while the sky grew brighter. It was not long after that everyone else had started to wake up and get out of bed. We still had to see more, but we needed to pack everything up since we would not be returning to this place. I was grateful to never have to be there again, and after our bags were packed and we were getting ready to take them downstairs to the car, I looked at the attic door. I felt chills trickle down my back, and my eyes widened when I realized that the board on the right had been moved. The board had previously only had a 1/4-inch crack, if that, towards the bottom before we fell asleep. That last night. And now, it was widely and noticeably cracked open nearly 2 inches. I couldn't help but be terrified to have something that could have occurred to be confirmed by this minor detail. The board was moved. Something or someone had to have moved it while we were asleep through the night. Had we been stalked? Quickly, I packed our belongings into the car and never looked back. While driving away, Kathy and I discussed what had went on. I asked if she'd ever heard of the rake, and she denied ever hearing about it with a confused look on her face. I described a few accounts that I had come across and read and related them back to what happened to us, telling her that I had kept them from her to avoid frightening her any further. No sooner had our car left town did I start to feel normal again. Any unnatural feelings were gone. I never wish to return to the Lake District. Rake or not, I know I don't want to go anywhere near that house ever again, whatever it is. My freshman year of high school, I was out trick-or-treating with my friends. We got separated into two different groups. It was me, my best friend, and one other friend. We went down the wrong street, and right before we got to the main road of the neighborhood, as you can see the Halloween decorated houses and trick-or-treaters on the other side of the street, was a being. I'm not sure what it was exactly. It looked exactly like a Nyanzangi spirit standing on the corner of the street. He was watching us as we walked, and started walking up to my best friend. She gets scared and I notice it, so I stepped in front of her. The thing got in my face, not saying a word to me. I stood there holding her hand behind me, trying to keep my cool. I looked at it in the eye and told it Happy Halloween, and it's a great night out, and cool costume. After a minute of keeping my cool, it finally turned around and walked away to the other side of the street, not taking its eyes off us. So we continued on. I told my mum later when I got home, and she called my grandfather, who's a medicine man, and I spoke to him about it, and was told we were not allowed to wear those outfits outside of ceremonies. I told him how I took it, and reacted. He was thankful I did not get scared, and showed my strength against it. We drove from Mesa, Arizona to the reservation that weekend so he could do a prayer for me and keep me protected. I just didn't think too much about it at the time, but I'm pretty sure I saved my friends from getting hurt by a supernatural being. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I really do appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed tonight's Skinwalker stories. Very close to the festivities indeed, if you do celebrate them, of course. I hope everyone has a festive time. In the UK, things are looking pretty bleak and miserable. So, there's that. But I hope everyone has a really, really awesome time, regardless of where you are in the world. Hopefully this vaccine gets rolled out quick smart, hey? Well guys, I'd like to extend a huge thank you as always to my amazing patrons and members. And if you'd like to give me a present, well, you can sign up to either one of these platforms to receive a host of unique benefits, but only if you really want to. But for now guys, it's time for me to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.